Thank you so much for agreeing to this time together. I am Monique Moultrie, and today is July 22nd, 2023, and I'm joined here with Reverend Khristi Adams. We're conducting an interview for the Garden Initiative for Black Women's Religious Activism's Oral History Project. In this oral history, we're going to capture a few milestones in your life. It's meant to offer an overview of your life story. And since our interest is social justice activism, there will be certainly questions that are focused around this. You can skip questions, you can answer questions in any way you want. You can choose to go on your own direction. The point of an oral history is this is your narrative. So you tell the story the way you want to tell it. So if I ask you about Princeton, you won't talk about Princeton. Perfectly fine. In an oral history, you direct the story.
Okay.
And so I follow your lead. In a typical oral history, you will hear me making affirmations, yes, but very little. So it's meant to be your story. You are the star of this show. So don't think I'm disinterested in not paying attention when I am not more vocal. Okay, so at the end of this oral history, I'm going to ask you to sign a consent form. In that consent form, again, you get to choose how you want this material used. We have plans to house the digital archive, the digital recording itself on our website, along with the biography and a resource guide for you. We also have planned to document the actual interview itself, the transcript, at the AUC library. Before we do any of those things, according again to the transcript, you can decide how you want it used. Before anything is used, you will have right of first refusal. So we'll send you the audio, we'll send you the video, we'll send you the transcript. I will send you the photo that we're going to use to accompany it. It's probably one of the photos we took today. And you can say, no, I want my professional photo. You can say, you know what? I told this story about this dude and I changed my mind. That was not really crucial. We have editing software. We can edit that out. Again, this is your story. Part of what there is to understand in oral history, though, is what we're trying to capture is how people really are and how they really speak and our real mannerisms. So when you come back, if there are ums and ahs, or if you say like a lot, and in script, you don't like that, we don't like to edit those out. We want the actual transcript to match what people will visually see and hear. If it, again, is about the big picture, it's like a story you don't want told, that we're happy to edit out. But dialects and those kinds of things, we like to leave in. So oral histories begin in the beginning. So can you tell me about your early life? What type of community did you grow up in? What was your neighborhood like? What did you do for fun?
Okay, I'm going off for a little bit because I'm writing right now, and I'm literally writing a book that is where I have to go back and it's like a memoir-ish publication, and I'm having to go back and remember things that I hadn't remembered in like such a long time. So I'm smiling because it's like it's both and it's been a cathartic experience to write about it, but now to talk about it is going to be like something, on top of that. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in the early 80s. And it was my dad was a police officer turned detective for New York Port Authority. And my mom was an educator. And it was just me, my mom, my dad, and my brother. We lived in an apartment in Brooklyn on 17U, I remember. And I went to a private school called Brooklyn Junior Academy. It was a Black private school. I also say I'm from the South to an extent because I spent my summers growing up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. My mom's side of the family, we had one of those families where you drop the kids off in the summer.
Yes.
And so
I'm from Danville, on the other side of Rocky Mount border.
Right. Well, yeah. So when anybody smiles, I know that they know Rocky Mount. Other people will be like, "Is it Rocky Mountain?" I'm like, "No." But yeah, I was, one of the siblings and the cousins that were dropped off with my grandmother, my great grandmother, and my great aunt, who was my grandmother's twin. All lived in a one story, 2-bedroom home in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, with my uncle Bunk, who was paralyzed, and my aunt Vita, who suffered from a mental illness, and it was, that was who lived in the home. And I was potty trained in Rocky Mount. My grandmother potty trained me. I mean, that was the type of family that we had. I thought everybody, was dropped off when they were younger. My mom jokes that, there was one time where she came back, her and my dad, and all the cousins, everybody ran out. They were excited to see them, and I ran toward her and then ran back to my grandmother because I didn't know her. My mom was like, "All right, that's it. I can't do this. It's too young." So, but I had this northern experience in growing up in Brooklyn, but then very much a southern experience of, playing in the backyard. We had a ditch on the side of the house, and getting to know our neighbors and going to church with my grandmother. Just being able to play in the den and not being able to play in the living room because that's not where you're supposed to play. So that is what I would say are my earliest memories. We spent our summers there. We spent major holidays in Rocky Mount. So I thought everybody, like, I thought that was what people did, that they went south, and it was that way well into my teenage years, not necessarily every summer. When my grandmother passed away, late 80s, and my great-grandmother passed away first, and my grandmother passed away. They both had cancer. And then my great aunt, Aunt Mary, who was my grandmother's twin, she wound up taking care of my Uncle Bunk full-time. We had one of those families that you just, you don't put you don't put anybody in a home if it's family, if you have the means. This was a 60-something-year-old single black woman who was, the main caretaker for her brother, who couldn't speak, he could speak, but not very clearly. But I say all that to say I've been writing those stories and from those memories because a lot of that shaped my childhood, but it also shaped like a lot of my theological point of view, my perspective, having strong women. My grandfather actually lived in another house in Rocky Mount. He would come by and bring Granddaddy. We call him Granddaddy. Granddaddy, he'd come in the house, bring popsicles, like that's what Granddaddy did. He came and he brought off, popsicles. We hung out with him. He worked in tobacco fields, but then he went home. I just saw the women in our family as being the pillars. My mom has one brother, and she's one of 6. So it was 5 women and one brother. And they all have very unique names. It was, my mom's name is Antoinette, so Tony, Jane, Toxie, Vita, Heather, and Greg. And they were the Clarks, the Clark family in Rocky Mount. Everybody knew them as. My Aunt Vita was she wound up going to Howard University and then going to Howard Law School, actually marrying somebody from Howard Med. But, I grew up with these just strong women.
Yeah.
And
phenomenal.
So that I think was a lot of my, like I said, it shaped my worldview. I think it shaped a lot of my leadership, definitely shaped a lot of my theology, just going to church with my grandmother, listening to her explain things. We had one of those Our Daily Bread things in the middle of the table, where you just they were different colors and you pick one out. And then there's a scripture on it, and the cousins, we'd have to sit around the table, and before we eat, she'd be like, we'd pick one out and pass it around, We used to play church, get in trouble for playing church. I mean, there were just things like that I do remember growing up that I have, and later in life, have had to not admit, but realized that, wow, my theological education started in Rocky Mount, North Carolina as a 2.5-year-old, 3-year-old little
Mm-hmm.
girl, and not necessarily later in life as I thought. So
Excellent. So you talked a bit about the intercommunal or care for family as a thing that you did. Can you talk about some of the other values you thought you were given as a young person? Did they come primarily from your grandparents? Did they come from your parents? Did they come from school, the private school
yeah,
experience?
I think the early private school experience was very disciplined. I mean, I had a uniform on at 2.5. My dad even says today, he's like, I can't believe we put you on a bus at 2.5, but he's like, that's what we were doing. But he's like, regrets it to this day. But I just remember being in pre-K in a uniform and sitting in desks. And I remember my kindergarten graduation. I recited, I too am America. I'm the darker sister. I mean, those were the
Wow.
yeah. I mean, looking back now, but again, it was like normal for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so the excellence, the approaching things with excellence, there was no, you're too young to learn certain things. There was an expectation that I believe that junior academy administrators and teachers had of their students, that I do believe like it instilled in me a great deal of discipline and just an understanding of just sort of coming correct, right? Coming 100 or putting 100% into in anything that you do, even something like a kindergarten graduation, right? I think I did I Too Am America, and then I sung a duet of like The Greatest Love of All by Whitney Houston with my best friend Tasia,
Aww.
So I do remember that, but pretty much everything else was family. I remember prayer was a big part of our family. You're not going to get on the highways and the byways. I remember that was part of the prayer. We're not doing anything without praying,
Okay.
and it was always like really long, and the family would gather around, particularly if we were leaving each other. So
Was
you
this a
never,
Christian prayer?
yeah, it was sort of the Baptist Costal thing
Mm-hmm.
that we didn't really have I didn't have a Pentecostal upbringing, more of a Baptist one, but my grandmother, and even my Mary, they had a little bit of longer prayers that felt a little bit more Pentecostal than anything. But we covered they just wanted to cover everything, health and safety, just anything you could possibly think of. And we'd be like, oh, the cousins. But that was a big part. And they grew up in a household too. My mom was sharing me that they had my great grandmother would say it's prayer time, and then wherever they were, if they were playing in the neighborhood, they had to come to the house. She did the 6 a.m., 12 noon, and 6 p.m. prayer was something that my great grandmother inherited and that she sort of passed on to them. We didn't have that necessarily as a growing up in my family, my immediate family,
Mm-hmm.
but prayer was still something that was important. And I just recently realized that was something that they had been doing. Um, my mom even says they used to have something called Holy Convocation, where next door, where they grew up, like her uncle, I don't know a lot of these family members, her uncle, and then her aunt, who they call Aunt Sister, they used to have like 4 a.m. prayer, and they would go over and they would do it for 5 days,
Mm-hmm.
in a row, and they call it Holy Convocation. So the prayer, I realized that was sort of inherited and passed down.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think there are some things like, spiritually, but also personally, a lot of the values came from my family.
Okay. And so you mentioned prayer and kind of a Christian centering. Was spirituality, religious practice a part of your non-summer practice? Was it a part of what you were expected to do either in school or in your home?
In school, early on, so we moved to New Jersey in the second grade. When I was in the second grade, that was when I first started going to public schools. So in school, anything, I mean, it was just a completely different environment. It
Mm.
was mostly white. that was the beginning of me being around white people, period. Because Brooklyn, when I grew up, or when I was born, was mostly black. It didn't really change until a little bit later. So I'd only grown up around black people. My family and my school was just all black. I hadn't really been around white people until second grade, when I went to this really, really big elementary school, and it was mostly white people, maybe one or two black people. So it felt like before then, faith and our black identity and culture were just like one. So even though the school, Brooklyn Junior Academy, wasn't a Christian school, we did say grace. There were certain things that were just sort of naturally a part of our everyday.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't infused in religious education, though, there. But I think there was a passing down, I think, when it came to, like, the black community. Of like, there were certain things that were naturally just a part of what we did.
Mm-hmm.
But again, and we did go to a church, Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. I was christened there. And my grandfather on my dad's side, Dee, he was at a church in Brooklyn. It wasn't that one, but my dad came from a Baptist family. My grandfather was a deacon, so my dad eventually became a deacon. And he was a deacon at Bethany Baptist. My mom was a deaconess. It was sort of like by default at the
in New Jersey.
Well, in Brooklyn first. Then when we moved to New Jersey, we looked for a church home, and eventually found First Baptist, and then they became deacon and deaconesses at FBC.
Okay.
And my religious sort of training or experiences really were shaped mostly at that church, and it began at that church. Just sort of like I said, the prayer and certain things that was a part of our family, but we weren't a huge religious practice family, my immediate family. So there were things that we did, read the Bible, but we weren't necessarily having like Bible studies, in our living room per se. We were big believers in being a part of a church that was active in the community. So it really wasn't going to just be church on Sunday morning. It was very much, what is the church doing? That was very important to my parents.
Okay.
And at the time, my pastor, Pastor Soares, had a huge commitment to youth development, youth empowerment, community development, economic empowerment. That was his platform coming in. He came in the same year that we came in. So we were like, great, that was something that they wanted to be a part of. So we had our typical vacation Bible school and Sunday school and, just the life of the church being in choirs. But then there was also, after school programs and tutoring and volunteering and, any block parties, anything that we could do in the community. And it wasn't just, we were never sort of taught that we were like, it was not a charity thing. There was no missions conversations like that. We were missional, I would say, but we really saw the community as the church as an extension of the community. And that we were very much, we weren't necessarily living in that community because we went to church there. We lived someplace else. But Somerset, New Jersey, where the church was that's where we were. We had a responsibility to them, to the students and to the kids and to the adults. So that was really what I grew up around.
Okay. I'm going to pivot us just a little bit, and do let me know if this screen goes.
Oh, okay. I saw it and I went like this.
Great. So you just talked about the value of community and being active in the community, even if you weren't geographically tied to it, even if it wasn't your neighborhood. Can that to me speaks to a sort of commitment or a messaging around social justice or social responsibility. Can you think of did you notice any commitments that your family, other commitments that your family talked to you about around social justice?
Again, I don't know if it was, I felt like my family and my church, like that was my family, you know, like I can't really explain. I, I felt like if it was coming out of my church, it was also coming from my family,
Okay.
you know. Um, and a lot of the reason why I say that is because as my church grew, we were a part of that growth. We were a part of creating the sort of movement that was taking place. So we were so active um, in sort of bringing to the table our ideas and creativity and things like that as a family unit
Mm-hmm.
to contributing to what was going on in that space. So the conversations that were happening at church were still happening in my family. You know what I mean?
A deep level investment.
Yeah, we were deeply invested. So, and then also my mom, as an educator, you know, and she worked in New Brunswick public schools and she worked in special education. She started off as a teacher in special education, then eventually was a chairperson in special education department. For many years, she was a class advisor and a mentor. And so I remember going to her school and the kids in New Brunswick, you know, Miss Adams, they loved my mom. My mom went above and beyond. So I saw that as her job, but also social responsibility, right? Like she didn't just see what she did as getting a paycheck. It was very much her calling and her vocation. And I feel like part of my commitment to young people today is an extension of what I grew up around, you know, seeing my mom. And that spilled over too into the church because we were committed to educational excellence as well. And there was a lot of partnerships with local schools. A lot of the young people at the church went to the local schools.
Okay.
So those were things that were they were a part of my family. They were a part of sort of what we did every day. I would say my dad, I would say we had a whole lot of social justice. There wasn't a lot of, I didn't grow up around a lot of the negativity when it came to the messaging around police. My dad was a detective. It wasn't until later in life that I started to be like, oh, you know, there's like a lot of, and I don't even want to use the word negativity, but
Backlash. And,
yeah, you know, and justifiably so.
Concern.
My dad, and because he worked for the Port Authority, it just felt like it just felt very separate, very different. But the conversations we didn't have at home about necessarily what he was doing. Worked at JFK Airport sometimes, you know, there might be a drug bust or something like that, but he didn't bring that home.
Even after Rodney King and some of those.
I don't remember. I remember Rodney King, but I don't remember him in relation to Rodney King, if that makes any sense. Like, I never connected it. But again, I mean, I think Rodney King was, 1994,
5.
So I was still maybe 12 or 13 and still very much self-serving, right? I was, like, very much into my whatever was going on at school. And whatever was going on TV and stuff like that, which I feel like I was protected to an extent, but I very much knew what was going on, but never connected it.
Okay.
Never. I don't know if it's because there was no social media, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the conversations that are being had right now, because they're able to be had via, you know, most of these communication streams, you know, in school, we might talk about it, but it wasn't really. It just, and especially in white schools, the white public school that I went to, you know, honestly, the only time I remember talking about anything was the O.J. Simpson, you know what I mean? Because they were just so mad.
So mad.
A few black folks that, you know, I was in junior high, we were like, yes! We didn't even know why we were saying yes, you know? But we were in school and they were mad. And those are the things that I remember. But I remember seeing Rodney King on TV. And my dad was... you know, if something was happening that wasn't right or if there was an injustice, he would be vocal about it, you know. So I never heard my dad say anything that I was like, ooh, I don't know if he's, you know, like, if I agree with that dad, like, you know, I because I never heard that come from him either. I did. That might be another reason why I didn't necessarily piece that together. And then he retired 1 year before 9/11. So my, you know, anything after that I think I would have had a little bit more, like been a little bit more cognizant of, but prior to that.
Okay. So let's transition in the interest of time, because oral histories are usually an hour to two at the max, because folks get tired of talking about themselves. Let's transition to you choosing Temple University. So why Temple? Why go there? Why choose your major in advertising?
Yeah.
What was
Most
leading
of it
you?
Stumbled on. So I played a lot of basketball growing up.
In high school?
In high school, before high school, just year round. I started off on an AAU team in elementary school.
Oh, okay.
And I'm short, so most people don't just like automatically see that. So
point guard.
I had to be point guard because I was short. But it was one of those where the high school coaches would go down to the elementary school and see all the kids playing and then say, I want you 6, and then put us all on an AAU team and just tracked us. Wow. So it was one of those, my parents were very much, that was another reason too why I think when things were happening, I was not shielded, but not really my world was basketball for so many years. And I wound up, and this goes somewhere. So I wound up transferring from my public school, my sophomore and junior year in high school, to a predominantly Black private Catholic school. So it's almost like I went back to my roots, even though it wasn't a Catholic school, because I struggled so much in the public school system. Couldn't even really articulate it, but racially, just really just struggled. That said, when I switched teams, I also switched AAU teams, and a friend of mine who went to my church, who also played at a point guard on another team, was playing on our AAU team. And so I came a lot out of my shell when I went to St. Peter's. But she got killed one year when we were... I'm also writing about that. But she got killed when I was 16. Her dad killed her. And then he killed her mom, and then he killed himself. And it was the weekend we were supposed to have a basketball tournament in Connecticut. And it was a real, I just had never experienced anything like that.
You can imagine that.
Yeah. That changed the trajectory for me because everything was basketball up until that point. It was just, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to play ball. No, we all playing ball. Mm-hmm. And after that, it was like, why am I here on this earth? If that could happen to her, that could happen to me. And all of these existential questions came up and crises. And so I was well on this path to be recruited to play at whatever schools. I hadn't been looking. This was this was the way end of my junior year. So all this was happening going into my senior year. I hadn't looked at any other schools just for any other reason other than basketball. So even if they were just these random schools that, didn't make any sense, well, I was going to play ball, so it didn't have to make sense. Mm-hmm. But by the middle of my senior year, it was like, I don't know if I can do that, Then it became, well, I'm going to, maybe this means I need to play at the school that, her name was Norrell, that Norrell wanted to go to. She wanted to play at Montclair State, so it became, I'm going to play at Montclair State. Oh. And I got waitlisted at Montclair State, like, weirdly, and the coach was like, I don't know how that happened, like, that's a mistake. So they went back and they were like, oh, somehow she got into the academic pile. She's supposed to be in the athlete pile. And so that didn't sit with me well. I was like, wait, academically, I got into these other schools. How come academically you guys wouldn't consider me? And that just didn't sit right with me. Mm-hmm. So it was the way into my senior year that I finally just pulled from that. It didn't feel right. But I had applied to 2, like, safety schools. Like schools that had nothing to do with basketball. Okay. One was Hampton. No, actually 3. Hampton, Temple, and University of Maryland College Park. I pushed University of Maryland College Park to the side, and I said, I'm going to go to Hampton. My aunt, Heather, who has since passed away. Her husband, my uncle, he was a Ghanaian artist, and he was a professor at an art professor at Hampton University. And so I spoke to them, and I'm like, I'm coming to Hampton, and they said, why don't you try to go visit Temple, and if you don't like it, then come on to Hampton. But we want for you to visit Temple first. And I was like, I mean, I'm coming to Hampton, but we'll go. So me and my mom, we went and we toured Temple, and I was like, this is it. This is where I'm supposed to be. And we just, it was the last minute. I mean, it probably was like June at that point. And we just put the deposit down that day because it was at the very last minute that we could have done it. And that's really how I got to Temple.
Okay.
Advertising wasn't, I think I didn't know what I wanted to major in, and I saw a movie with somebody in it that was an advertising exec, and I said, maybe I'll do that. So that was one of those, I think looking back now, I would have just like not majored in anything in the beginning, but I don't know if I was like, if they let you do that then. I think you had to choose something.
Okay.
I wound up sticking with advertising because by the time my 4 years came around, my mom was like, listen, this is it, 4 years. Like, if you change your mind, you're going to have to figure something out after. So I said, all right. And that's how that happened.
Okay. While you were in school, while you were at Temple, did you have any spiritual practices, any community practices? What sustained you?
So my freshman year, not much, because I didn't have to. I grew a church girl, deacon daughter my whole life. So it was like, you get to college and you're like, I don't have to go to church. I don't have to do nothing. So I'm sleeping in, and then maybe halfway through freshman year, it was like, something's missing, That's when I started to take ownership, I think, over, well, why was I doing all that those years? It wasn't just because my parents brought me to church. Did I believe? Why do I believe what I believe? So I wound up joining the gospel choir because it's like, what are you going to do? You join the gospel choir. So I joined Temple University Gospel Choir. And that was where I was able to sort of sustain a bit. We were singing. We were, going to different churches or schools to sing, just like when I was in the choir in elementary school and in high school.
Okay.
So I think that's what started it. And then the next year I became vice president of the choir. I wanted to just step up in leadership there. And then after that, I wound up starting my own campus ministry. I wanted to start a performing arts ministry. My upbringing in church was so our motto was faith in action. So we were very do. If there was a shooting in the community, what you going to do about it? How are we going to march? How are we going to, respond to it? Everything was response, call and response. And I appreciate that. But I think where it lacked was that's how I lived out my faith, was just action.
Okay.
So I didn't understand. I knew, prayer, and I would journal, my prayers, but I didn't really understand the importance of like daily spiritual practice and that just being sufficient. It was like I wasn't a good Christian, I felt like, if I wasn't out in the community, if I wasn't doing something or starting an organization or something like that. And so I think it helped, but I also think it hurt because in the times that it's like I didn't feel like I had any meaning or any purpose if I wasn't doing something, which in the long run, now in retrospect is like I'm having to give myself even more permission when we talk about self-care, when we talk about seasons of just like, relaxing or chilling or just being and existing and that just being enough. It's a lot of that I think has to do with my upbringing.
Okay. So I am going to shift us a bit, but also in the same vein, you mentioned here stepping up in leadership in specific ways, and you also talked about being inculcated into you should do this because you
That's
should.
what you do.
This is what you do.
Right.
You should do this. So, can you speak a bit about the leadership lessons you learned in that stage of life?
At college,
Mm-hmm.
oof, I
What
was
type of leader
really
do you think
arrogant.
you became?
I think I was very arrogant, because most of my mentorship, and we were talking about this a bit earlier, it was me observing. It was sort of indirect. And so because I was observing people from afar or from arm's length, I would do more mimicking, I think, of how I thought they were acting or thought they were.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I understood like the substance. So I would start an organization or leave an organization. I would think I was like Creflo Dollar or something. I don't know who I thought I was, whoever was the person during the time,
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't a lot of substance. So
All the swag without the
yeah,
hours earned.
and people and followers. I don't know what I thought. So I appreciated the confidence. You know what I mean? But and then I didn't really understand that it was arrogance until years later. So It wasn't a lesson that I think I learned in that moment. I think I had to learn the hard way and things that, the repercussions of that. But I think at the time I thought the devil is attacking me or the enemy's out to get me, you victimize yourself.
Yeah. Trying to block what I'm trying to do.
Right. And it wasn't to say that I wasn't gifted. And I think if God came and talked to me then at times, say, no, I'm not saying you're not gifted, It's really interesting to say that because you look back now and there might be people that you're like, that I'm like, how is it that they're doing that and they're just not great people, I think you were talking about something like a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
And I have to look back and think about, that time in my life where there were things that were happening that were blessings, I believe, and things that were coming to pass and visions that I was seeing and enacting and that were happening. Doesn't mean that I wasn't arrogant though, right? So all those things can exist.
Yeah.
God, I wish I had the direct mentoring at the time to really deal with me in that area. If I did have anybody, they were like enabling a little bit,
Hey, you've been a willing worker. You want them.
Right. Yeah.
Go
Especially
shine.
if they say, oh, you're anointed and you produce results.
Exactly.
So there was that. I think that's probably the biggest one that I had to learn because I already knew growing up at FBC and with Pastor Soaries as at the helm, you want something to get done, you do it. And so, that's what you did. There were no, even if you failed, it was like, you're still going to be blessed because you tried, because you put 100% into it. There's a lesson in it, even if it's a failure. So I never was afraid of like not succeeding or things not happening, that I saw. So I'm grateful for that. But the arrogance, the youth, those types of things. And I feel like Temple was like a great space for that. There was no social media or anything like that. So it's like, it's not following me. I mean, God, I hope it doesn't. But like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like we were able to just exist and be and make mistakes.
Right.
And be young, and it be left there. And you deal with certain things later, but it doesn't like follow you the way that it does with kids now. So like they can pull up tweets from somebody, from when they were 17 saying, you remember when you said this? I'm like, I can't imagine. I mean, I hope that I wouldn't have said anything, but who knows?
Who knows? Right. So what did you do after Temple? What was
after
next?
Temple? Oh God, I'm embarrassed. I went to Regent University. CBN, Regent University.
Yes.
For one semester. Because I knew I wanted to go into ministry. I wanted to learn more. but I did not want to be a reverend, and I didn't want to be. I mean, I am now, but I didn't want to be in anybody's pulpit.
So were you thinking Christian education?
I wasn't sure.
Mission?
I just was like, I wanted to knock on people's doors, be out in the community. Again, what I thought, how I had my upbringing. I had one experience the end of maybe the beginning of my senior year this summer at Duke University. Duke Divinity had a program called Duke Youth Academy that I was invited to be a youth counselor at. And it was my introduction to seminary before I graduated from Temple. And it was so racist. it
Duke grad.
Oh.
Yep.
Okay. This was
I understand.
2002 that I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy named Rodell was there. He was there and he invited, I don't know how I got there, but it was through him. And he needed some other they needed some other black people, basically, which is I think how I got there. And it was leading high school kids in this, and they got the money from the Lilly Foundation, so they had the money. Gosh, it was so racist. I hadn't experienced anything like that, ever. But it was also like theology and so when I left, I said, I'm never going to go to a school like that. Anything that even remotely looked like a traditional seminary, I was like, I don't want to have anything to do with it, because of that experience. So I don't know where Regent came. I saw Regent was like, I knew it was attached to CBN, but I just was
they really love the Lord though. They can't be that.
It was right. It was very event. It just felt non-denominational. It felt non-traditional, even though it was.
Yes.
So I went. I didn't like it, and I wound up working at a residential treatment facility for teenage girls with severe emotional difficulties. That is when I believe my calling. I believe I answered the call there. I was working, so I wound up not even going to classes at Regent. I would go the first month, and then I was like, this is not for me. So I just wouldn't even show up at class. I would just do the work, and the work was novice. It was writing your prayer journal, and it kind of looked like they were white. It wasn't like Duke, but they were also felt very racist too. So I just didn't really go. But I started working more hours at the treatment facility, and the girls were 13 to 18 years old, pretty much all black, and they were one step from juvie, and they lived there. And I remember I would tuck the girls in at night at the end of my shift, go home, go to sleep, wake up, and be there at 6:30 a.m. And the girls were they had been beaten with baseball bats, and in their chart they were. Cigarettes put out on them and anything that you can possibly think of. And so I have deep empathy for them. I grew so close with those girls in 6 months I was there. So when I accepted that position as a youth specialist, I left. I had to leave Women in Need of Guidance and Support. It was called WINGS, the unit for the residential treatment facility. And I left. I remember the day before I left, I went and bought the girls' journals and Bibles and hand wrote them all letters about their purpose and their future. And I was just so attached. There was 10 of them. And my unit supervisor, she was crying. We left. And I just remember there was one girl, Carrie. All the girls were crying. They ran to their room, whatever, when I walked out. And one just wrapped her arms around my leg as I was walking out the door. Oh. And it was me, but they also experienced so much abandonment in life, So a lot of the reactions were to that. Somebody else they got close with was leaving. And I remember telling the girls, if I'm going to help anybody, any other girls like you in the future, I got to leave because I got to start this journey. I got to start this path. And so that's why I say that's when the ministry for me, I feel started toward youth advocacy. The seed was planted. So then I worked as a youth specialist at the Community Development Corporation for maybe about 2 years. And then Princeton was when Princeton came up. Princeton was only half hour from where I lived. My pastor went to Princeton. Everybody that I knew had gone to the seminary. I was triggered because I felt like it looked like Duke, the campus, and I was like,
So
I don't want to go here,
I
I look like Duke. But I started to change, of course, and grew. And I shared it. I don't know if I even shared it in my interview with Victor Aloyo, was the director of admissions, and we interviewed me, and I believe I had said something about Duke during it or whatever. But I actually went in as a Master of Arts in Christian Education because I said I just want to teach. I don't know where I'm going to teach somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like just 2 years of that. It's the same like stuff as the MDiv program. It's like literally the same classes except just 1 year extra for MDiv. So I wound up just staying for the MDiv program.
Okay.
And that's basically how that happened.
Okay. So after Princeton, did you return to the church? I know at some point you ended up in California.
Yeah.
So
I went back to the church because I just still didn't know, when I was there. A lot of people in the seminary were like, I want to be a pastor. And I didn't want to be a pastor. I definitely didn't want to be a senior pastor. And I thought about going into the PhD program, but I was so burnt out. I mean, around this time, the seminary, the MDiv was 90 credits. It was just felt like another college. So I just couldn't even imagine staying in school.
Yeah.
I applied a few places with just nonprofits. And then my pastor wound up saying, come on, we need a director of youth ministries. So I went and I became director of youth ministries. In my 3 years there, I was licensed and then ordained. The week I got ordained, and I was ordained American Baptist, the week I got ordained was the week that it was like my ordination was my goodbye, because I got in the position as associate campus pastor for preaching and spiritual programming at Azusa Pacific University. And I moved to California a week after I got ordained. So that was basically how that happened. Okay. I liked working in the church, but it was very familiar. It was my home church, and I wanted to just spread my wings and go somewhere else. And I didn't necessarily want to work in the church, but I still wanted to work with young people. And this position came up. It was faith formation for young adults. I liked APU. APU is of that sort of evangelical, Christian Council of Christian Universities or something. But there was just something a little bit different about them, their commitment to diversity. I never felt othered there. Okay. Which was really a very interesting, I think, testimony that I have for being in that space. I grew up a lot in California, but I never felt othered, like ever. So I went there, and I was there for about 4 years.
Okay. So you've talked pretty consistently about an interest, a calling around youth development, youth empowerment. Mm-hmm. So at what point did you decide to focus specifically on Black girls?
I was teaching It's interesting because I had always, it didn't matter what space I was in. It was a reciprocal relationship of Black girls gravitating in my direction and I'm gravitating in their direction. Mm-hmm. Princeton, I wouldn't necessarily say that because we weren't really around young people at my church because it was a Black church. I didn't really pay attention to it, even though the Black girls I spent a great deal of time with there, but I was like, it's a Black church. So I didn't really think of it as like a singular calling. Yeah. When I got to APU, because it was a predominantly white space, I had a lot of mentoring relationships with the Black girls, and the position of campus pastor at a school like APU is so public that any Black, particularly Black girls, they would just come to the office. So I wound up just creating groups like, hey, come on, let's meet up, let's hang out. But I just thought at that time it was by default because I was a Black woman. And then when I left APU and I went to Georgetown, same thing. I was just spending a lot of time with the young Black women. So it has followed me, but it wasn't until I moved back to New Jersey very briefly, and I was working as a pastoral counselor at a Christian wellness center, that parents were bringing in their young, from as young as like 8 years old to early 20s. They would be young Black women, Black girls that I would be counseling. And they all felt like they all had like similar issues. And I said to Miss Welcome, who was the clinical director, we need to just get them all in one room together, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then I created something called the Becoming Conference, which was a conference for Black girls. And that was when I started to pay attention a little bit more and formulate the words to articulate that, wow, Black girls, that's been the common thread in a lot of the spaces that I've been in. They felt very much like a calling.
So, in addition to the calling around Black girls that you've identified, you also have perhaps another passion or passion project or another avenue, your creative endeavors that have also centered Black experience with Black girls, Black women, Black culture. So for you, do these serve as passion projects, avenues for social justice, social responsibility, just another side of your personality, something to do that isn't ministry?
All of the above, literally. Like, they're definitely passion projects. I definitely feel like they're part of my calling. I also said, right now, if there's any platform that I have that I'm given, I'm going to use that as a space to advocate for Black girls, to highlight their experiences, to share their stories and their narratives. That was where the first book came from, because I didn't set out to be like a writer or an author. But when it was presented to me and somebody came to me and said, hey, consider pitching for our publishing company, immediately I was like, no, that's not something I want to do. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute, this might be an opportunity to share Black girl stories, right? Mm-hmm. That would have never been heard had the opportunity not come to me. So I always saw it as that. There are other creative endeavors that I've had. I've written plays, and they weren't necessarily about Black girlhood. There was one about Black womanhood. And most of them were passion projects. But I think anything right now that I do, I'm very intentional about uplifting Black womanhood and Black girlhood in some way, mm-hmm. in any of these projects. So if it's a play, if it's a short film, if it's now, it just happens to be writing. And then at some point, maybe it'll be fiction. Maybe it'll be, maybe it'll be mm-hmm. a movie at some point. But that's what I'm committed to.
So alongside that, in talking a bit about the things that you have built, the things that you have chronicled that amplify Black girls, what models of leadership do you think you particularly chronicle in your book, Black Girls Unbossed? Mm-hmm. And how did you become attuned to what leadership looks like in youth? Because I asked you a question about your own youthful or young adult leadership experience and what you learned from it. So what do you pick up from?
What models
mm-hmm.
that I've seen in them?
What models you've seen in them, and how did you learn to pinpoint that as not disrespect, but audaciousness?
Yeah.
Not this, but that.
It's so personal to me. Like, when I think back on my own girlhood or the mistakes that I've made, even in my young adulthood, it's so personal, because it's like the phrase where it's like, you have good intentions, but maybe sometimes they're bad results, or mm-hmm. people that mean well. So I know what I meant, I know what I was experiencing, or maybe was misunderstood. And so there's an empathy, a deep empathy that I have for some of the ways that may come out, maybe negative, or from the outside looking in with some of these girls. I have like a penchant for turning it and saying, well, no, it's like not like like a whisperer, right? Not like there's a show, The Dog Whisperer, that I can't think of it, but like a way that you can that I can like interpret, right? That Um, it's not anger, or where's the anger coming from? And a lot of it is because I remember being angry, right? Or I remember certain things and how I was feeling, and not having anybody to channel that in a toward my gifts and toward my strengths. And so
Mhm.
that's what I try to see with these young girls, right? To be able to articulate for them. There was one girl I was teaching the book Unbossed to a group of girls at this leadership academy that I teach at every summer, called At the Well. And we were talking about strategic leadership, and she had said, like, so interesting, because I always saw forefront leadership, and I thought maybe that's not me, like, but I'm very strategic, but I never saw it as leadership. And she said, but now I know I'm a strategic leader. I'm not
Mm.
necessarily like the person with the microphone. And that blessed me, because I'm like, great, like, that's something that this girl at 16 can articulate in a way that I wasn't until much, much later in life. So if I can help in some way, then that's great.
Perfect. That led me to another question I was going to ask you about the impact you had with the well talks, and what
The Well Talks.
the
Well, there was something called the Well Talks at Georgetown. That was something different. Um, so, oh, okay. So at the Girls Leadership Academy, I teach for pretty much every summer, and I'm going to teach next week, actually. Um, that's fun. It's fun stuff. Sometimes I teach Parable of the Brown Girl. I've taught Sister Citizen. And these are
Mhm.
girls that are in high school. And I'm not in charge of At the Well. It's just a program that I've come to as a
Okay.
professor. I'm helping and doing more for that program, but it's just fun to be in the room with them and to introduce them to new ideas and thoughts, and introduce them to books and resources that I wasn't introduced to until I was in graduate school, to talk about things and to articulate their struggles. And so I just want to be a bridge or a gateway or an avenue for them in some way. I think that all of us and Black girls are just trying to find their way home, trying to find our way to each other.
Yeah.
And I just want to be a guide.
So, for those who are reading your story, who may not know the distinctions between age ranges of Black girl versus young adult Black
Mm-hmm.
woman, what do you think the leadership styles differences are?
Between Black girls and oof. It's interesting, because with Unbossed, my vision for that was, one day one of these girls is going to be Ketanji Brown Jackson. One of these girls is Michelle Obama or something. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be something if we had something in our hands to read about who they were when they were 16 or when they were 15, and their emerging leadership at that time, and how it has evolved. And so that's my hope, that one day one of these girls will be that we could look back on this and we have it documented.
Exactly.
And so it's not so much like I see a difference. I just see like seeds in them, they're excited. But there was this quote from Andrew Young a long time ago about Martin Luther King. And he has said, he didn't just spring out of the head of Zeus one day and that was it. He matriculated, he grew. So I don't know if I see a difference in the leadership. I think there's a fearlessness that young people have that sometimes as women, we get imposter syndrome, and we're a little bit more hesitant. But there's a novice that they have that we have more wisdom in. I think we can glean from each other. And I'd like to see Black girl leadership brought to the table a little bit more, when it comes to that sort of intergenerational leadership, so we can hear, like, how did you start that organization? What made you think, like, tell me a little bit more about your TikTok page or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot we can learn from them, and vice versa.
So, in reading about what you've been doing, post what you gave us as your bio, the Womanish book, do you think that's part memoir, part doing this work of showing others this intergenerational conversation? As
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to finish it. I gotta finish it. Every time somebody says it to me, it's a reminder that I gotta work on it. Because it's supposed to come out next summer. But it it's interesting because there was a girl I spoke at a high school in Brooklyn, interestingly enough, about Unbossed a year ago, and she rose her hand during question answer, and she was like, "Do you, why don't you write about yourself?" And I was like, "I don't write. I write Black girl stories. Like I just like did the whole thing." And she was like, "Write. And I said, "Well, who's gonna read about me?" And she was like, "I will." And I was like, "Oh." And it just sort of put it out of my head. And I had thought about it ever since. And when I thought about womanish, I actually didn't think of myself again. I was still thinking, well, we need a Black girlhood theology that's separate from womanist theology, that is still very much a part of womanist theology. And but when I was pitching it, my editor and my book agent were both like, but you're always talking about your Black girlhood. Like this is partly how you were formed and how you were shaped. You have to, write about yourself. I'm like, are you sure? So a good chunk of it, each chapter, is how I was introduced to, like when I mentioned about Narelle dying, that was when I was introduced to theodicy. Um, Scripture, my grandmother introduced me to salvation. I'm writing about my baptism. I'm just thought about like, wow, there's so many community,
yeah.
That was formed when I was a kid. But I've also interviewed contemporary Black girls today, teenage girls, but also Black women, because they're Black women. My therapist is in her early 50s. She's like, interview me, she's great. And so she was like, yeah, I remember mama, what mama said, it went. And so talking to Black women and listening to them reflect on their childhood or in their teenage years.
Yeah.
Or like, I remember when I got saved, and whether they still profess to be Christian or wherever they are in their life right now, their sort of upbringing, they recall with these, distinct memories. I'm putting that in the chapters as well. And then using womanist theology, period, to like inform that. So it's not out the window. It's more like in conversation with.
So just a personal point of privilege in the interview. Why isn't that womanist? Why is that?
Why isn't it womanist?
Why?
You know what?
As adjacent to or beyond or something different?
I think it is. I'm not saying that it isn't. Because I say for so long it has been, but I've always believed that Black girlhood studies or Black girlhood should have a category, should be on a shelf, right? And so girlhood falls under womanism, and I think there's an assumption about girlhood that it just sort of like when I'm reading, it's like, oh, well, they're in this too, and it's true. But a lot of times it comes from a adult lens, and I'm curious about the childhood lens. So when I'm writing, like even my own story, I'm very careful in my writing of not trying very hard not to put too much of my adult self into it. Like I'm like, how do I remember that baptism, right? And as opposed to interpreting the baptism from like who I am now as a 41-year-old. So what I remember in the baptism, I was recently writing about it and saying, I just didn't want to drown. Like I would practice in the bathtub at home, like those are things that out of my 10-year-old brain.
I love it.
And then the last thing I'll say about that is like, I remember coming up out of the water and thinking, I'm new. This is it. This is the first, I'm not going to hell. And I'm new, and it wasn't until a few years after that all the rededication and that's basically it. I think that they should have their own thing, but it's like, it's not separate. You know what I mean? Like I don't want it. It's not the antithesis of, or it's separate. It very much is just it's like the baby of womanism. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Oh, I was talking about my right. Okay, so I was saying my baptism that I'm reflecting on things, but I'm making sure, okay, how as a 10-year-old did I think about that? And I was saying that after the baptism, and I felt like I was new and I'm not going to hell. But then like 3 years later, that was when I was introduced to like rededicate your life or you have to sustain your salvation, and I'm like, wait a minute, nobody told me that. So those are the things that I'm making sure to like write. Um, how did I interpret that, you know, as a Black girl? And then I'm asking, certain teenagers now if they have a particular religious upbringing. Were you bad? Do you remember? And yeah, I remember. Did you know what you were doing at the time?
Mhm.
Or the girls now, my parents, they still send me scripture on my WhatsApp. I'm like, why are you sending me scripture before school start? Like that type of thing. Those are the things that I'm like making sure to put
Okay.
down.
Okay. So I had two more
Okay.
questions, a third if you had time.
I got time.
Where did they go? I got discombobulated.
Mm-hmm.
So, first question is, what's your second act? What do you wish for furthering your call? Where do you see yourself going as a leader, as a faith activist, as a pursuer of social change on behalf of young girls?
It's weird. I think my the first part of my calling was providing safe spaces for Black girls, whether that's a conference or counseling or opening up my home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's never going to go away, but it's not as prevalent as it was in the beginning. Now, a lot of it has been on paper, the writing or the speaking about. I spoke at a conference not long ago and did a workshop on Black girls in predominantly white institutions, independent schools, excuse me. Those types of spaces where I'm sharing with adults and sharing with others about Black girls and Black
Mm-hmm.
girlhood. I don't know what the next part of that will look like. So it's like safe spaces. Now it's the writing and the speaking. I know there's something else.
Mm-hmm.
What will that look like? Will it look like, is it an organization? Is it sitting on the board of an organization? Is it um, adopting? I've always been, interested in like, how do I take this advocacy a step further? There's so many kids in the foster
Mm-hmm.
care system, Black girls that are just stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean taking a teenager into my own home? It's like that's like next level advocacy for me, where it's not just like, all right, I can shut it off at night.
Okay.
So I try to think of ways, what it will look like and ways that I can extend that advocacy and that ministry in creative ways, but also like deeply personal.
Perfect. And the last question, I had a question about your current job and
Mm-hmm.
your pursuit of the EDD, but you choose to talk about that, or you
Mm-hmm.
can just get to the last question, which is what I ask all of my interviewees. What brings you joy and what sustains it?
My dog is first one. First thing that came to mind was my dog Daisy. Brings me joy. Interesting because I talked about my friend Norel who got killed when I was 16. Like that has been like a consistent like friends, like close friends dying has been like a very like consistent theme for some reason, like every decade of my life.
Oh,
That it's just it's like you almost have to laugh, like even up until like this past October, I wrote Parable of the Brown Girl, one of my best friends. He had a seizure and died. I mean, those things like a week after I signed the contract for the book. So I wrote the book in grief. I talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
My seminary experience, my godbrother died. I mean, I just remember these, and they were all young, 35, 37, 16, 30. And I say all that to say it seems like cliche, but very much like appreciating the 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 relationships that I have, my family,
Mm-hmm.
my best friends, um, like I said, my dog, I mean, just the few that are left, and just really appreciating them and being around them, my niece, my nephew, my brother, my sister. Um, that brings me joy. I'm trying to not allow it to bring me anxiety at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, because what comes with great love is, great loss. But everybody that has passed, you could not have told me they weren't gonna be here forever. Like it never crossed my
Mm-hmm.
mind. You know what I mean? Like it just never crossed my mind. So so those are things that I wish that I hang on so tight now because I wish that I was like either told or, when they say, things aren't forever and you appreciate things. I was like told that and went in one ear and out the other. It never really like registered to me. So so being around them in those moments, those are the things that like bring me
Mm-hmm.
great joy. I just have to went to school. How did I get to Hill?
If you wanted to, we could stop there. It's up to
Just
you.
in a brief, like education is a part. It's an extension of my youth, the youth advocacy in the ministry that I feel like for young people. But it also is very much what my mom. I grew up around my mom as an educator, like and above and beyond. So even being in a boarding school now that's 24/7 is like even though my mom wasn't at a boarding school, kids were at the house.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's what it's what we did. So I never it just clearly has left an imprint on me. So for me to be in that realm right now, I'm going back and forth now though because I see that as a completely separate like life than
Mm-hmm.
like what I'm doing with my writing or other youth advocacy. I just see it as completely separate to the point where, my supervisor would be like, "You don't want to talk about your book here? You don't want to didn't you just sign a contract?" I'm like, I don't, it doesn't even cross my mind to bring it up there because it's not for the, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, that's not the space for that. I don't, I don't even want to mix it for some reason. The only time I do is when I'm working with the black girls. Um, that's
Mm-hmm.
about it. Or obviously in the classes that I teach, um, a lot of my background, those things come out. But it's like when school is out, I'm doing things like this. I'm doing teaching at the well next week. I'm writing my book. It's like school is out. I can now focus on those things. And school gets back in, other stuff goes on pause for a little bit. Um, the doctorate in education, I deferred for a year because I'm just not gonna do it. It's just that I don't know how to pay for
Mm-hmm.
it. But I may want to be ahead of school. That's a trajectory that I'm on right
Okay.
now. And at the Hill and the trustees, they're all like, we're prepping you to be ahead of school one day. And it's hard for me because my energies I want to put into things that I just talked to you about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, do I really want to put my energies into that? Um,
Do you think that degree will give you resources or skill sets that you need to add, or do you need the credentialing?
I think it's both and. The particular program that I applied to at VCU is specifically the resources, the networking, and the skill set to lead a school.
Okay.
Um, so that's why I applied there because it was like, all right, if I'm gonna at some point be ahead of school, I was looking at their curriculum, the program, just how they go about and sort of shaping their program. I was like, this would really help.
Okay.
But also it's a credential at the same time. But it's like, yeah, I know whatever I put a lot of energy into things that I'm like committed to. And if it takes away from this other part of me,
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anymore. So that's what I'm like. That's currently where I'm at in life, just sort of thinking through, like, because if I'm going to be ahead of school, I want to go in that trajectory. then I want to commit to it, but I don't want to feel like I push any of this to the side,
Okay. Makes
So
sense.
we'll see. I'd love to, if that doesn't work, or if it's not the path, then go back into higher ed um, somehow. But it's like in higher ed, you kind of need the credentials. So at that point,
Mm.
I kind of, so.
So the question I'll end us on is the question that you skipped. So I'll
What I
answer it.
skip?
What sustains you?
Oh,
So what practices
sustained me.
solidify you, bring you back to the moment, bring you back to your best self?
I didn't realize how much of a contemplative I was until like later in life. I'm introverted. I just went on a retreat in March. I need like 2 of those a year and I'll be good. And I mean like an actual retreat, not a women's conference that's overplanned. You know what I mean? Like that's what I
Yeah.
used to think of when I thought of retreat.
Yeah.
This was like an actual, like in the middle of the woods in Puerto Rico somewhere. We were eating plant-based foods, we were doing yoga and meditation and prayer, and it was a lot of quiet time, a lot of alone time. And it was like so good. I like absolutely need that in my life. Not just that retreat, I need it in like those moments.
Yeah.
So I could just say, oh, prayer sustains, but like I almost need to go to like a monastery. Like I need silence. Um those moments, I think that's a spiritual practice that I feel like any type of contemplative spirituality that that just that's it for me. I feel like I come out better.